Yeah, I had never really failed. I know that sounds crazy, but I had never really failed. And so when you don't fail, you just keep going because you think that's the way it should be. And you don't question, or I didn't question, what is this doing to me personally?
Welcome to the Smart Gets Paid podcast with me, Leah Niederthal. I help women land higher paying clients in their independent consulting businesses, but I've never been a salesperson. My background is in corporate marketing, and when I started my first consulting business, I learned pretty quickly that it's about 1,000 times harder to sell your own stuff than it is to sell someone else's. So I taught myself how to do it, and I created the sales approach that I now share with my clients so they can feel more comfortable in the sales process, get more of the right clients, and get paid way more for every client contract. So whether your client contracts are $5,000, $100,000, or more, if you want to work with more of the clients you love, do more of the work you love, and get paid more than you ever thought you could, then you're in the right place. Let's do it together. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to rate, review, and share. Hey there, Leah here, and thanks for tuning into this episode. I hope wherever you are, wherever you're listening to this, I hope you're having a great week, making some good progress on your business, and of course, taking some time for yourself. So if you've ever sat in on a webinar of mine or read anything of mine or just been listening to this podcast, you've probably heard me say that when I was teaching myself how to sell, I read 65 books, right? And I used what I was learning with my own clients. You know, anything that felt salesy, I just ditched. And anything that felt good, I used and sort of wove together with the other things that I was learning to create what became my selling approach and the approach I teach my students. And I often cite those books, you know, what I learned in them as the foundation for my selling approach. You heard me do that in the episode with Dr. Deborah Tannen, whose concept about one up, one down really changed the way I felt about myself in the sales process. But recently, I've also been kind of reflecting on another source of knowledge that I came across along the way that might have been maybe at the time a little quieter in its influence, but which really shaped me and taught me through our experiences together. And that is, you know, the people in my life. And so I've started reaching out to those people who have really influenced me and shaped me. And I've been inviting them here to the podcast so that I can share with them how they shaped me and how what I learned from them is showing up in my business today. So I actually reached out to one of my old bosses from the agency world. So from 2005 to 2009, I worked at a below-the-line ad agency called Arc Worldwide, which right after I got there, or kind of sometime around then, was purchased by Leo Burnett. So I went from sort of working for Arc Worldwide to working at Leo Burnett. I worked in new business, and we were responsible for pursuing and pitching new client opportunities for the agency. You know, we would assemble a team of strategists and creatives and media people and account people from across the agency and across the network. And we would work like crazy for 6 to 8 weeks or so to prepare for a pitch. And the pitches would be these like huge events, total dog and pony shows where we would present full-blown strategies and multiple creative campaigns. I mean, it was insane, and it was also really intense. I mean, if you've ever worked in the ad agency world and you've been a part of a new business pitch, you know how crazy it is, right? That was my life all the time. And in that role, my boss was a woman named Lisa Hurwitz. And I thought Lisa was the shit. Well, actually, she was the shit. I don't think I realized it at the time, but she was the youngest VP in the company's history. And she was in the room leading the entire business development strategy for the flagship office of a multinational advertising agency. And she actually wasn't that much older than me. Coincidentally, we'd actually gone to the same college. And so I knew exactly how old she was. We were there at the same time. She was a few years older than me. And so the fact that she was so accomplished, I mean, I was just in awe, and I learned so much from her. So when I thought about reconnecting with the people who shaped me and, you know, made me who I am today, I thought of Lisa. And I left in 2009, and which is feels like ages ago. And since then, she's gone on to have this huge career in consumer packaged goods. and she started a cannabis beverage, which we're going to talk about in our conversation. But I reached out to ask her if she'd be on the podcast, and she wrote back the next day saying, of course, she'd be happy to come on and chat. And so that's the conversation that you're going to hear today. And it's really interesting because what I thought we were going to talk about was like what we had learned in the agency world and in new business and what we did with that experience and, how that has shaped our careers and yada, 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 right? But what we actually ended up talking about was something a lot more interesting, which is when you've been raised to be super smart, well-educated, work hard, and achieve success and just keep like driving, what happens? And we talked about the pressure we felt about being raised to succeed and the pressure we put on ourselves and how that affected us both in some really serious ways. And it reminds me of the conversations I have with my clients, who nearly all of them are type A overachievers and perfectionists who work really hard. And you're so hard on yourself. Like, of course, we're all of us, so hard on ourselves. And at the moment when they reach out to me, all that drive has gotten them to a certain place, but it might not be serving them anymore. Because it's like, you're raised by people who, of course, love you and want the best for you. And you're imbued where you're like raised with a sense of wanting to achieve, but it can have some serious effects, which you'll hear Lisa talk about. And a few episodes ago, I talked with the author Rachel Simmons, whose most recent book called The Curse of the Good Girl is about this exact same thing, about the pressure that society puts on girls growing up, the pressure that people in our lives put on us, and how it affects girls in the moment and then adults later on. So this is a really timely and very real conversation because that's kind of who we all are. All of us type A overachievers, we are what Rachel calls the good girls. And so part of us as business owners, and I've talked about this in a few episodes, but part of this is needing to start paying attention to how that's played out in our lives and it's currently playing out in our businesses. So if you are a self-proclaimed perfectionist, and I know many of you listening to this podcast are, you will really see yourself in this episode. So listen in on my conversation with my old boss, Lisa Hurwitz, after this. And at the end, I'll come back and share a lesson you can apply to your business.
Lisa, thank you so much for being here. It's so fun to see you again and be back in touch.
It's my pleasure. This is so exciting for me. I remember our time together in the agency days so fondly, and I'm just so excited to see how your career has taken off. And this is such a treat. I love it.
Yeah. And I remember you as such a force. I mean, as when we worked together, I was just like in awe. And so it's so fun to like come back and, be talking to you and be able to share a little bit of your perspective with my folks, with my listeners.
Well, I appreciate that. I felt the same way about working with you. And I knew, that all those years together, you would go on to do awesome things. So this is like a full circle moment for me. And it's awesome to be here.
Oh my gosh, that is so nice. Because also this is, I don't know, certain people, it's like, you'll always sort of like be my boss, right? On some level. So to be here, to like hear you say that is just like, I don't know. I feel like I'm back in, what is it? Like the late aughts, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was almost, I don't feel like we're that old, but maybe we are, right? We both have kids, like we've gone through a lot, but yeah, it was probably around 2005 and it's 2022. So there you go.
Well, so in the years that have followed, I feel like I've sort of stayed loosely connected to your career and it's taken some really cool turns. Just bring me up to speed, walk me through those years and what are you up to now?
Yeah. So you and I worked together. Gosh, it was definitely 2005 to 2008, Leah Burnett year. I was running new business. I was getting married. I was moving from the East Coast to Chicago. It was insanity, right? I think I, at the time, was one of the youngest executive vice presidents at Leah Burnett. So I just felt like this enormous pressure at 28 years old. And, I did the agency thing for a long time, for almost 15 years. I went on to run the P&G business at Leah Burnett with the ARC side as well. And then went ahead and went into media, which I quickly realized after about a year and a half, that the media agency space was very different than creative. And I wanted to go back into a role that was more kind of creatively driven and brand oriented. But I felt like I had to keep growing my career, right? I didn't want to go just back into the agency side again and manage a big piece of business. So I went to the client side and I became a global marketing VP at Kimberly-Clark. I'd spent a lot of years working with Procter & Gamble, which I can talk to you more about. They were kind of like a mini MBA for me, which was pretty amazing. And then I went in-house to Kimberly-Clark and spent 3 years there, traveling all over the world, getting a really fascinating kind of global perspective. And then I got sick, and we can talk about that kind of turning point in my career. And that drove me on a personal and then a professional level into cannabis, which is kind of a consumer packaged goods category, kind of a retail category, definitely an emerging category, incredibly dynamic. And I spent 2 years as the chief marketing officer of a big multi-state cannabis operator out of Chicago. The business was sold in the summer of 2020. And then I've been an entrepreneur since, doing a bunch of different things. Most recently, I, starting in October, became the president of Happy, which is a new cannabis-infused beverage company out of Michigan. So the cannabis-infused beverage space is absolutely exploding. Happy, one of the things I love about it is it's really aimed towards new consumers, that like Canna Curious, and women in particular. And so it's kind of a really special product for me and a special brand in that way. So it's been a crazy 15-year ride, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, doing the hard charging CPG route and then the cannabis route, and now, at the helm of this new brand. I think that's amazing. And I want to talk about, the things that you kind of picked up along the way. And now I didn't realize, like, I knew you and I are not too far apart in age, but I didn't realize that you were an EVP at 28, which like blows my mind. What was that like to sort of be in the rooms that you were in at that time? I mean, we would spend hours in these like pitch meetings with, the brainstorming or whatever. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because I was sort of always that like classic overachiever. I thought that achieving meant, sort of financial freedom. And I also thought like the more stress I had on me, the more successful I was going to be. Like stress equaled success was sort of like just a no-brainer for me. That's how I kind of had grown my life. So I went into this and felt like, wow, I've got this big opportunity at 28. I'm leading new business for a global agency. And, I was really, to be honest with you, I was stressed and anxious like almost all the time because I thought, hey, I'm only 28. I'm the youngest person in the room. And the other dynamic was I was almost always the only female. There were a couple of very senior female executives at Leo Burnett. One I'll talk about who I really looked up to was Catherine Guthrie, who ran the P&G business. But there were very few mentors for me. And so I felt like the little sister often to a lot of people in the room. And that forced me to like take on this sort of crazy drive that, frankly, Leah, I don't think I stopped until I was 40. So for 12 years, it was like this, and I think a lot of women are the same way. It's like you see that if you achieve, especially at a young age, you can lead to success, and you don't realize the toll it takes along the way. The little stresses accumulate, right? The late night hours, the weekends. I mean, new business in the agency world is probably the most stressful job to have, right? You're pitching, you're up against deadlines, you're working with multiple different teams of people, the creatives and the strategists and the producers. And so I just thought that's what life was supposed to be like. And that's how a job was supposed to go. You were supposed to be burnt out. And I would say I loved it, but at the same time, I think it took a huge toll on me. And frankly, that job at 28 set me on a 12-year trajectory of just grinding until I turned about 40.
Yeah. Well, and I always remember one thing that I was so impressed by with you was like, you always seemed very like cool and calm and serious, right? And like, up to the task at hand, but you really had it together. And you might've been like, like a duck, like, under the surface, your legs are like going like crazy, but above the surface, you look very steady. But I think what I didn't know at the time or realize at the time was what was going on, how stressed you really were. And, what I've come to find out in my whole, everybody knows like I'm a personal development junkie, but if you sort of tamp down stress, if you sort of push it down, it will find other ways to pop out.
100%. And, I was a bit of an anxious kid. I always sort of had a little bit of anxiety, But you're 100% right. Like I learned over time. And I think part of it was honestly, women get, and I don't want to stereotype women in business, but you can't be that emotional when you're the only one in the room. Both being really young and being female, like I was very, very conscious all the time of like how I appeared to other people and appearing calm. And then I would have like a breakdown at home later. I would just, I would do all these things to try to overcompensate for the anxiety I felt. And then, of course, when I had kids a few years later, it just sort of snowballed because then you have no time for yourself, as a mother of young kids. And suddenly you're like, okay, all these, like I could go for a run or I could do all these things, and you just don't have as much time to sort of manage stress. And, what I learned, and honestly, what led me into cannabis, and we can talk about that in a few minutes, is that stress like comes out in your body in weird ways. Like you can't avoid it. Like you can't. And when it's cumulative over so many years, it just has its way. It's like a little genie in a bottle, right? Or like a bottle of, Coca-Cola, you take the lid off after shaking it and it just like explodes everywhere. And that's what happened to me, but it took a long time. I mean, and don't get me wrong, like I loved the thrill of new business. I loved the thrill of pitching, of the agency world. That job taught me, and I think this is really relevant to your, audience here, how to sell, how to story tell, right? Like I learned that, and I'm grateful for it at the age of 28, right? I learned how to put a story together, and it served me very well, as I've built brands over the years, but also as I've like built my own story and how to put my own story together. And I think, telling a story to new prospective clients and selling to new prospective clients, as I know you're so familiar with now. And maybe that's why you went in one direction, from that experience, and we were linked in that. And then I kind of went in a different direction. But I think there's nuggets of our experience together that feels, very genuine in sort of that storytelling, selling, pitching space, which is really cool.
Yeah. Well, and it's so funny because I work with a lot of women who are like, I don't know how to pitch myself, or I get on the phone and I pitch. And what's really ironic coming from new business, where we did like literally pitch, and we had so many like, the whole dog and pony show and all of that. It was a whole production, to the way that I work with women now is I actually say, you don't have to pitch, because they come in and I work with a lot of women who have worked in agencies, and they assume that like they need to sort of present at someone and present their value or whatever. And I think that there are things that you can take from pitching, right? Like, how do you make something matter to the person on the other side? How do you tell a story? How do you keep people's attention? How do you demonstrate, help them like fall in love with their future? But, so all of those are things I like brought from new business, or, picked up and carried along with me, but teaching it now in a very different way where you can use it in a conversation, and it doesn't have to be this, like, I am on stage pitching at you. It's more like I am selling with you instead of at you. And that was really valuable experience from that time.
I love that insight. And I think it's very interesting because when I made the move to the client side from the agency side, I was in a global role and I was in sort of this like central group. And so you're still pitching to a degree, but you're all on the same team. And I was pitching other groups within Kimberly-Clark on new ideas. And it felt much more like similar to what you're describing, where we were together on that. Like we're all at the same company and we all have the same goals, right? And so I love that. I think that's an awesome insight. And I felt definitely much more of that as I moved on to on the client side.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about, I want to go back to something that you said around, like shaking a bot of stress. And actually, let's go back even further, because I feel like you touched on a little bit about your upbringing, and you and I grew up in a little bit of the same environment in that, the ambition and the drive to succeed and the drive to learn in service of success really entered our mental space at a really young age.
Totally agree. I mean, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm the oldest of three. I was fortunate enough to go to a really great private school. And it wasn't even like I questioned it. It was like, you're supposed to get good grades. You're supposed to get to a great college. Then you're supposed to go to a great job. Then you're supposed to get married. I mean, the drill. We all do. And as women, especially, I was the oldest, I'm like, of course I'm going to do all of that. So by the time I got to this role at Leo Burnett and at 28, I was like, and I also got married at 28. So that was, exactly what I was supposed to do. Right. And then I had kids around 30, like I was the cookie cutter. And honestly, Leah, I mean, we'll talk more about this, but until I turned 40, I didn't deviate much from that. Right. I didn't really realize how inauthentic some of that was to me, like who I really was until like later. And that's been the blessing of my 40s, I think, is like this, you kind of gain this perspective. But yeah, I had never really failed. I know that sounds crazy, but I had never really failed. And so when you don't fail, you just keep going, because you think that's the way it should be. And you're like, you get a little bit of a high, no pun intended, we're talking about cannabis, but you get a little bit of a high off of being successful and getting that next promotion. And you don't question, or I didn't question, what is this doing to me personally, right? Is this good for me personally? I just went, wow, this is really cool. This is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be successful like this, right? And I was getting these accolades, both externally from my family, from my friends. And I felt like I didn't even question jumping off this trajectory.
Yeah, it's really funny. I mean, your story really maps to my story as well. And it's funny in your telling of it, that's like literally almost how I tell it. Like, private school, good grades, like best college I could get into, get the best job you can and get the next best job, and, on and on and on. And I think you learn a couple things. I mean, what you said is just like, you're so raised in that it becomes just like, this is the norm. This is what I'm supposed to do. You don't really question it. And you also assume that success is linear, right? Like you just keep going up and up and up, which means that, at least for me, like any sort of setback really, really hurts. And your point about having never failed. I mean, I know, and it sounds like I'm being an asshole saying it, but I really hadn't. And then part of it is like self-selecting, right? I sort of learned from an early age not to do things that you don't succeed at, because yeah, like I used to joke that I didn't like playing cards because like in my mind, my type A overachiever mind, like if I try my best, I should win. Right. And gambling is not about that. Like the house wins or the deck wins or whatever. And so I hated gambling, but and I have people like my mother-in-law asked me one time, she's like, have you ever played an instrument? And I was like, oh yeah, I've quit all the best instruments, yes. Like I quit piano and I quit clarinet, because I think that if you are raised like that and succeeding is either explicitly or implicitly, just, that's something that you are taught to value, you stop testing yourself. You certainly keep pushing yourself, but you don't ever let yourself fail. And if you're afraid of failure, you're going to push yourself really hard.
It's a fascinating conversation, because I think it affects both your personal life and your professional life, right? Like I didn't take any risks. I mean, I went from agency business. I ran P&G for a while. I loved P&G. I was super comfortable in the packaged goods space. I went to Kimberly-Clark, which is a P&G competitor, in-house. Like I didn't deviate. And in my personal life, the same way. Like we lived in Chicago for 15 years. It wasn't until, and I have a crazy COVID story, as you know, but it has pushed me so far out of my comfort zone. Like we're living part-time in Nicaragua. I've learned to surf, which is so humbling and scary and terrifying on a million levels. And what I watch, I will tell you this all the time, is the husbands or brothers or fathers get in the water and the women don't down here. It's amazing to me. I'm often, it's funny. I thought of myself in the boardroom. I'd often be the only woman. Down here in the water, I'm often one of 10 in the water, and I'm the only female, because I think, again, this point you made, and I think women are more conditioned to it than men, just by their upbringing, of let's be risk averse. Like if you're not going to succeed at something, don't try it. If you're not going to become a great, amazing surfer, don't get in the water. And I'm like, but how do you know that you're going to be, or what if surfing brings up all these other amazing things for you, right? Like what if you just get to clear your head and meditate in the water for an hour? Is that success or is that failure? So I think it's a fascinating conversation, because I certainly felt it. And for, at least 15 years, ran on a very comfortable track, putting myself in enough positions career-wise where I knew I could succeed, but they were stretching me enough that I would also see them as success. And it wasn't until I went into cannabis that I was like, a big left turn. And same with my life on my personal life. It wasn't until we moved to Nicaragua and I was, basically in a Spanish speaking country where I had to flex my muscles in Spanish and everybody surfed. So I felt like I needed to get in the water. These things that just make you, truly understand that if you take risks, there's just so much exciting stuff out there that you would never know if you don't put yourself in those positions.
Yeah. And I think you're so right. But you do have to have this moment of like, something has to shift for you to start to see it, because otherwise you're just going to keep going as you go, And I think I had a little bit of that moment when I came out, right? Because at least on the personal side, not on the business side, but on the personal side, I was like, wait a minute, I think the way that the things I've just accepted to be true, like might not be true. And you start to sort of see things a different way. Now, that didn't really translate to business though. Like I kept charging hard. And when you're talking about surfing, it's so funny because I was thinking back, I had mentioned that I had been to Nicaragua as well and tried to surf there with, a former partner of mine. And she was like, where you and I are like academic upbringing, right? Like by the book, I like to like read all the instructions before I do it. So I know, how to do it right. And she had a lot more grit. She was like, just make it up as you go along. And I remember specifically about surfing, we had one of our biggest fights because I was like, how do you surf? And she used to be a surf instructor. And she was like, well, just do it. Just get on the board. Just do it. And I was like, no, but you have to tell me how to do it. So then I know how to do it right. And we ended up having this like blowout because it was such a clash of two approaches, right? Like two worldviews. Like I need to know how to do it right so I can do it perfectly versus like, I'm just going to make it up as I go along. And the making it up as I go along is something I've really had to learn. I mean, really in the last like probably 5 years.
Yes. You and me both. I mean, I feel the same way. And it's actually fascinating because my husband and my two boys who are 11 and 13, we all learned to surf at the same time. And my kids in particular, they're just fearless. Like to your point, they don't practice. They don't care. They don't know, this is the perfect pop-up technique. And like, I overthink everything. I'm like, my pop-up's this, my this. And my husband's constantly like, you're way overthinking this. Like, this is supposed to be fun. And my kids are much better than we are. And they just get up and do it, right? Because they don't overthink things. And so it's been this really interesting metaphor for me, because I agonize about every career decision. And, frankly, I wasn't a media person. And I went into a media agency for 1.5 years. And it was brutal for me because my brain, it was the first time in my whole career, my brain doesn't really think like that. I'm not about spreadsheets and flighting media. I'm a creatively minded person. And when I went into cannabis and I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but my moment, I mean, you talked about coming out, and my moment was I got sick in the spring of 2017. And what the real turning point, and my kids remember this, is I went out for a run. Running for me had always sort of been this like escape. It was like, I can clear my head. I throw on some music. I get to be by myself. And I came back with hives and I was like, oh my God. And I knew at that point that I was really run down. I knew that I was exhausted. I had been taking Ambien for the better part of 7 years to sleep. International flights. I was flying all over the world. My sleep was super screwed up. And I was like, this is it. I've got to go see a doctor. I've got to figure out what's going on. And it turns out I had an autoimmune condition that was, not extremely serious, but significantly exacerbated by my lifestyle and by stress and by everything I was doing. And so by the summer of 2017, so this was about 5 years ago, I had to go off Ambien, off of every pharmaceutical. I had to change my diet. I had to change my lifestyle. And I was like freaking out because this is how I had lived for, 12 to 15 years. I mean, I tried not to miss major milestones for my kids. I tried to be everywhere. I tried to make everybody happy. And, I ended up looking at cannabis as a way to help me go to sleep because it was medical in the state of Illinois at the time. I got a medical card. I threw myself, like you and I just described, like I researched every cannabinoid. I researched every strain, indica, sativa, like I threw myself into it. And I realized when I started going to these medical dispensaries, they didn't know any more than I did. And this was all going to be like trial and error. And I was floored because I was like, wait a minute, this is available to people. There's no education out there. It's a plant-based alternative to a lot of things, to alcohol, to pharmaceuticals. It's going to be federally legal at some point. 5 years later, those conversations are obviously still happening. And yet for women like me, there's zero education. At the time, there were no brands of any significance. Like, how is this possible? And so honestly, I spent a year just as a consumer and a patient in the cannabis category before it was on my radar that it could be a career. And in the, end of the summer of 2018, I left to take a chief marketing officer role. And I will tell you, Leah, I don't know if you experienced this when you came out and had some other major decisions, but there were the people that looked at me like I was insane. And then there were the ones in my life that were like, this is a fantastic move. You're a visionary, you're seeing what's coming. And it was really interesting. It wasn't always what I expected from people, but there was a lot of people. And I think because, I had always been this like straight and narrow for so long and this type A high achieving that not only was I getting off that path to a degree, I mean, I was still becoming a CMO, but to a degree, but I was also going into an illegal drug market, which for a quote, like good girl like me was insane. I mean, I didn't even smoke weed growing up. Like it just wasn't in my vernacular, because I didn't want to be that out of control. So to go work in an illegal industry where you can't get a 401k and you can't put it on, like a mortgage application because it's not recognized. I mean, there's so many things about that industry that are just not commonplace. It was really a turning point for me.
Yeah. I mean, how did you reconcile that with yourself? I mean, I know there are people in your world who were like, are you sure? This is not what we think of you, but how did you think about it on your own?
Typical me, I agonized over the decision for a long time. I actually had another job with a CMO role offer with a much, much more kind of normal company, I will say, big, well-recognized. And I agonized. I mean, months I agonized. And then finally I said, I think this is my opportunity. I said, I think that, this is the first time in my career that my personal and professional life had overlapped in such a serendipitous way. Like I was a consumer before I even had this opportunity, that if I don't take the risk now, then I don't know when I will. Like, I don't know how many of these opportunities are going to present themselves. And I just somehow garnered the strength, and my family was very supportive. My close friends were very supportive. Now they all want to get into the category and, but it was difficult. And I feel very much the same way about living part-time in Nicaragua. It's been the same for me. I think some people think we're insane. I know that they think we're insane. Like you don't have access to healthcare. There's a global pandemic going on. But at some point you have to, and I know it sounds cliche and I know you read a lot of books and, I read them too, but you just sort of have to trust yourself and also tune out the noise sometimes. Like you're never going to make everybody happy. Everybody is not always going to think what you do is great, but I know that they don't live in my body. They don't walk my shoes. They don't live my life. So at the end of the day, they don't get to make the decisions. I do.
Yeah. I think that, listening to yourself, tuning into your own body, just sort of tuning out the noise. That's also something that I've had to learn because I think it all sort of stems from how we're raised. But when you are this sort of type A overachiever, good girl, good grades, good school, good job, whatever, you sort of look outside for all of these markers of success, right? And like markers of achievement. And you don't have a really highly attuned sense of, am I happy? How do I feel? How do I feel in my body? Does this feel right to me? And, what a gift. I mean, sadly, right? Like to sort of go for a run, come back with hives. And I know that wasn't the only thing that happened. That just happened to be like the critical moment. It's weird to sort of see that as a gift that starts like teaching you a lesson, teaching you to like pay attention to that. I shared with you that like in the pandemic, like I basically like my hair started falling out. Like I'm, type A, super stressed out. Like, especially in the pandemic, I wanted to like solve all the problems for all the people and, be just as much in control as when we weren't in a pandemic. And it really, then my hair started falling out. And side note, this is sort of a widespread side effect of like pandemic related stress. But like, I think that, the ways that which we're so like prone to this, and like almost like pre-programmed for this. And it's really, sadly, you do often have a moment where you're like, wait a minute, this is not right. This is not, this is not right for me anymore.
Right. And to your point, and we talked about this a little earlier, it's amazing how your body will get to a breaking point and show you it's not right. Right. For you, it was your hair falling out. For me, it was like breaking out in hives. I mean, I had tons of other symptoms. Like I was getting sick a lot, getting sinus infections, getting like just for someone who's very healthy, right? I'm young. I mean, I was barely 40 at that time. And, I had healthy kids. Like this was a crazy, why was this happening to me? And deep down inside, I think I knew, right? I knew that there were other things kind of out there, but the other thing that always stuck with me was I never figured out, and you said this before, like success will come later. I never figured out why everybody waits till they're retired to do what they really want. Like that concept to me from when I was young, like I couldn't get it. I was like, but if I'm retired and I'm not, I'm 65 or 70, I won't have the health I have now. I won't have the ability to travel or the ability to take risks or do things and so that was always partly in my mind for many years. I was like, what am I working towards? Like, I always wanted to be a chief marketing officer. I very bad. And I did, I loved it. It was great. And there were things about it that were wonderful, but I kind of was like, okay, now what? It didn't feel, and you and I have talked about sort of a perfect career and like, what is a perfect career? And I don't know that working to the pinnacle of your career, C-suite level, whatever you're in, and then retiring in your 60s, that didn't feel authentic to me. That wasn't the life I wanted. Now, for some people, I think maybe that's great and that's what they want to do. But this taught me kind of this whole experience over the past 5 years. And it's funny because you and I both seem to have a 5-year time frame here of how we've been reevaluating things. It's really taught me that my body will often tell me things my mind won't, because I'll suppress it. And that I don't have the same view of my career and success and what's important to me as maybe what others do, this sort of societal path that you and I have talked about and led for a long time. I very, very clearly now don't feel like I want to retire at 65 and wait till then to do a lot of the things I want to do.
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting. This is not something we talked about in advance, but I'm curious to know my family and I played this game like over Thanksgiving where we started asking each other questions on this little box. It's called We're Not Really Strangers. And one of the questions was, what has been the lesson that's been the hardest for you to learn? And I'm curious, in both riding and driving in this hard charging career, and then, having this experience where you realize it wasn't right and going in this other direction that was unexpected, but has been really fulfilling. Like, what has been the hardest lesson, or the lesson that's taken you the longest to learn?
Yeah. And I think it's an awesome question. I would say it seems counterintuitive, but slowing down, working less, taking more time, not even just for myself, which I think is, pretty cliche, but like just in the pause actually has made me more successful. Like it sounds again, crazy. I thought, work hard, put the hours in, meet all the right people, get all the right jobs, go to all the right schools, like achieve, 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 achieve. Honestly, I have slowed down tremendously in the past few years. Like I have taken a breath. I've moved to a warm tropical climate. I've given myself the grace to try something as hard as surfing. And in all of that, I've put myself out there in ways that I'm not comfortable with. I started a women's and cannabis executive group when I left my CMO role in the fall of 2020. That has given me more than I could have ever imagined. And so I would never have done it had I not slowed down. I had job offers coming out of the CMO role. I had several of them, and several of them were C-suite roles again. And that would have been, again, the next logical turning point for me would have been, okay, now you did the chief marketing officer role at a multi-state cannabis company. You had a great exit. Go take another chief marketing officer role or and instead, I honestly, Leah, I gave myself time. I gave myself the gift of like slowing down, which was so hard for me to do because every time I would get an opportunity or recruiter would call, I would freak out and be like, oh, I got to take this. I got to take this. What if the next one doesn't come up? Like I was so programmed, and the gifts I've been given in that slow time, my women's executive group, meeting with a ton of different people that allowed me ultimately to land in starting a company with an incredible partner in Happy that is honestly like geared towards women. It is a brand I'm passionate about. It's a microdose beverage where I think, our vision is really to start, bringing women into the cannabis conversation in a way that 5 years ago in 2017, when I needed someone to bring me in and help me, like that wasn't available. And so I never would have had these doors open had I not slowed down. And I even now, sometimes I feel guilty, like, okay, I'm going to stop working when my kids are off at 3:00 and take 2 hours to go surfing. Like that's selfish. I think, oh, I'm being selfish by doing that. I'm not working hard enough. I should be doing all these other things. But there's a magic in it, right? I always come back with something that sometimes I have a freedom of a thought in the water, or sometimes I get out on the board and I look back on the coast and I think, oh my gosh, like, wow, I didn't think about, I have a new perspective. And I know that, again, it sounds cliche, but by far the hardest lesson for me has been slowing down and sometimes working less and taking more time to look around doesn't hold you back. It actually propels you forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love this. I mean, I think it's such an important lesson, and especially hard for people like you and me, and for the women who are listening, because we were, conditioned to believe that, like you said it yourself, success equals stress. Like those two things must go hand in hand. And if you're not, and also, another belief that's often programmed is like, to be successful, you have to work very, very hard. And so if you find yourself even purposely trying to slow down, trying to, take your foot off the brakes, this belief is so ingrained that you will like find ways to fill that time back up with stress or thoughts or overthinking, or, do you know what I'm saying? Or just like activity, business type activity. It's such a hard habit to break.
It is. And I really admire the people that are just able to sit with it. And I know I'm even too type A to try to meditate. Like I know, again, like it's funny because meditation is like such a gift. And I sometimes think that I find other ways, like surfing or taking walks or being in nature. I found other ways, but all of that, the pause, the stillness, the just slowing down a little bit. I think for women like you and I, Leah, 100%, it's so difficult. And I really didn't believe that I would be able to be successful doing it that way. I didn't. I thought, and in many ways, success to me looks different than it did. It certainly does than it did at 28. I mean, I have a president's title. I love running Happy, but there's only, it's a startup. There's six of us. It's hard. It's a crazy category. But I feel it's a different kind of success. And I feel also incredibly passionate about, I've always felt passionate about helping other women. And this is a great sweet spot. And then founding my women's in cannabis group, my WINK group, has been an amazing success. I mean, we have over 25 members now, but it's funny because it's not classic success. I don't have the title. So I don't always reflect on it. And even now that we're talking about it, maybe the first time I've reflected on it as being successful, it's just your view of success changes when you slow down a little bit. And I think that's another important piece to all of this, right? For people like us, it isn't just the title and the salary and the recognition, the external recognition. It's that internal piece that I think you have to grow into.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, talk to me about the brand, the beverage that you're working on now. I mean, I want to hear about it, but I also want to hear how you maybe are approaching this a little bit differently than you might have in the past with this newfound, mindset.
Yeah, I love it. So Happy, HAPPI, is a microdosed cannabis beverage. And one of the things that I was really passionate about, you'll find this funny, when I first went into a dispensary after I had gone off Ambien, was pretty desperate to be sleeping regularly. They call them bud tenders in the dispensaries. The bud tenders will often, they have very high tolerances. I never smoked weed. I was just trying to sleep, right? So I didn't want something super strong. And they gave me, for those of your listeners that know, they gave me an RSO, a Rick Simpson oil, which is a concentrate, which is like one of the strongest forms of cannabis. And it's often for, cancer patients, medical patients. And I didn't get up for 2 days. Like I couldn't get out of bed. Which was kind of funny looking back on it. And I tell this story sometimes, but on the other hand, it was a little terrifying because, luckily I kept going and believed in it and knew I would get to a place. But so this is designed as like a entry point. It's a 2.5 milligram. It's a sparkling water, all natural. It's vegan. It's really super low in calories. So, I think one of the things I've seen, and I know there's been a lot of press on this during the pandemic, is, women are turning to alcohol to like numb a lot of the feelings like we've been talking about, right? And or prescription drugs, but certainly alcohol, I think, is a comfort, and it's difficult. I think, people are trying to drink less now. They're recognizing this is maybe not great from a health standpoint. Alcohol made me more anxious. It disrupted my sleep more, so for me, alcohol is tricky. And Happy is amazing because I get to still be social and be in those occasions and have a drink. And it's a super, but I don't have that hangover the next day and it doesn't disrupt my sleep. It actually helps my sleep. So, I think it's been an awesome product from that standpoint. And then in terms of, how I'm approaching it differently as a brand, I mean, one thing I will say is we're testing and learning a lot. I have a great business partner. He's incredibly supportive of brands and marketing. And because I'm not working in like big corporate companies where there's benchmarks, like we're just trying stuff. And I'm giving myself like the leeway and the grace to be like, this is new. Cannabis is new. It's not even federally legal, right? We're only on the market in one state, which is Michigan, which is a very big cannabis market. And, I hope soon to be in more states like Massachusetts and Illinois. We're working on some of that, but just trying new things and not being afraid to fail. And I think those are the lessons we talked about. Like in my personal life, I didn't fail when I went into cannabis. I didn't fail when I left the CMO role. Like, why would I think I would fail with Happy, right? But I still think it, trust me, this is like me telling you, it's still, it's still in the back of my mind, but giving myself the grace and also to put things out there and to try new things and to see what really breaks through. And I also love that it is, for women. I love that piece of it. It feels very mission driven for me. And I feel like my personal story, I think, connects with a lot of women out there who maybe have taken Ambien or on antidepressants or on, anti-anxiety medication and really, or drink a lot of alcohol and really just want to turn to something else that's a little sort of less disruptive for their lives. So I think not being as afraid to fail is a big piece of what I've carried into the Happy. And I think we're going to succeed. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. Well, where can people learn about you, about Happy? Point us in the right direction here.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely hit me up on LinkedIn. My mantra on there is from toilet paper to rolling papers. So there you go. I get a lot of feedback on that one. Just Lisa Hurwitz on LinkedIn. You'll see me there. And then happy, please, if any of your listeners are in Michigan, it's Happy Hour Drink, happy with an I.com. And we are in, as of today, almost 50 dispensaries in the state of Michigan and climbing. So would love to hear your feedback, your thoughts on the product, what you'd like to see next from us as a brand. And we're also at Happy Hour Drink, again, happy with an I, HAPPI, on Instagram as well. So send us a note. We'd love to hear from you. Try the product. And yeah, thanks for having me, Leah. I've loved this chat. It's been awesome.
Me too. Thanks so much for joining me.
All right, so there's so much we could talk about here, but I want to just kind of zoom out a bit and acknowledge that when you're raised with these expectations that a lot of us were, and, we carry those expectations of working hard, achieving success, all of us, we carry them with us into our careers and into our businesses. I just want to acknowledge how hard it is for us to deprogram and I guess reprogram this programming. Like how hard it is to unlearn the lessons that we learned super early in our lives from people who absolutely meant well and wanted the best for us and probably had no idea that like encouraging us to get good grades would result in us, down the line in like never being able to try something new, right? So if you're like a lot of the women listening and trying to practice a better way of doing things that serves you now as a business owner, maybe you're trying to be less of a perfectionist, or maybe you're trying to practice just taking the first step to do something before you see all the steps, or maybe you're trying to practice taking a risk, or whatever you're working on, getting it to good enough and pressing publish, right? If you're trying to do all those things or a version of those things for you and your business, and you're finding that the process is really frustrating, you're finding that like this type of growth is really frustrating, just have compassion for yourself. You learned this stuff a long time ago. You've been practicing it in one way or another. And the lessons you learned a long time ago, you've been doing them, using them for years, and they sort of calcified over the years. And so sadly, we can't just like undo it because we read a book or saw like an inspirational meme on social media, right? It takes lots of practice, but the work is worth it because slowly but surely we'll get closer to where we want to be.